Hey, everybody. Welcome to the November/December edition of the Facilitators Tool Chest blog that I try to put out roughly every month. And boy, today we have a special guest joining us, and I'm very excited about this conversation. James Henderson from Lansing, Michigan, from Pat's at Lansing. He just took over that program probably a little over a year ago. But has been running this Accountable Choices Pattern Intervention program for close to 20 years. And I'm sure most of you out there have encountered James, have benefited from his work, and it's such a treat to have you here, James. Welcome to the Facilitators Tool Chest blog.
It's an honor to be here, Steve.
Well, I tell you, I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then I just want to ask you questions and absorb your wisdom. Because the last weekend, I had the opportunity to sit in with James and watch him work his magic. And what he was doing was a weekend orientation session for those who were coming into his program. And when I say weekend, it was a 3 hours on Friday night, it was 6 hours on Saturday, and 6 hours again on Sunday. And I couldn't imagine the system supporting that kind of an intervention piece. And by golly, the system is supporting it. And I was just really struck by how the men really responded to what they were experiencing in the weekend. And first of all, I want to thank you for creating that opportunity for me to see what you were doing with that. And I just want to spend some time just talking this through. How do you think about this? What do you see? What's let's just talk about what you're doing, James.
Well, first, the privilege was all mine. I really appreciated you and Paul and Gene coming to observe me. I think when we do this work, we try to think, okay, what's happening? What's the research showing? What are other amazing therapists doing out there? Then we try to implement it. But we need our brothers and sisters to kind of evaluate us, come and look at what we're doing and give us some guidance and feedback. So I really appreciated you guys being willing to do that. The domestic violence weekend actually is interesting because it kind of started for me way back in the 80s. I used to work for a drug rehab that was a therapeutic community. If people remember those were like kids helping kids, parents helping parents. And one of the things, we had a very intense program with the children. And when you wanted the parents to experience it, what their kids went through in the intensity, we created a weekend program for the parents. And they had to go through the same rules with their kids, same confrontation, no cigarettes for the whole weekend, no caffeine, had to deal with that addiction struggle. And we got so much movement through these parents through the weekend and built such an alliance with the parents through that intensive stuff that we decided to continue it and expand it when I came in and moved into the domestic violence world.
So, James, how did you get the system to accept that requirement that people would have to come to a 15-hour weekend thing as an introduction to the program? It seems like that was a big ask.
Well, it was, except for because it started with substance abuse first. They were kind of used to it there. And then, you had mandatory arrest that wanted these guys in jail. Yeah. Then you wanted these guys kind of busy for a while. So this was a way that we could keep track of him all weekend. He was being watched. He wasn't being let out on the streets. We knew where he was. And so the courts kind of liked that idea. The other thing that we did is we have guys write an essay. And really an essay of what they're learning through the program is to kind of keep them on target, to make sure they weren't daydreaming or, they weren't doodling and writing, stupid things, making their to-do list for the week. And then the courts were amazed at the amount of depth and understanding guys got about domestic violence from the weekend. It just blew them apart. And the feedback from the clients was our marketing now. They would go back, just think, you're the probation officer. And I'm a jerk. I'm totally blaming the victim. I'm playing I'm a victim here. I'm really resentful at the court. And now I come back next week and I'm able to tell you what abusive tactics I've done, how I've harmed my partner that I never realized before, how my kids were impacted. And I have goals set for myself on where I want to go. And so probation wants to send men the programs that hold them accountable, but they also want to send men to programs that they think are helping men, right? We all want to think that I'm sending him to a program that's going to make his victim safer, going to make his children safer, going to reduce the likelihood that he comes back in my system again. And so I can market that all day I want. But if my clients are coming in there marketing it and speaking truth, I think it had more weight than me. Because,
Oh, I totally can imagine that when officers or referral sources are seeing in the participants' own words, holy cow, this is what I'm learning, this is what I'm understanding. James, I'm really interested in hearing you talk about how you think about this, because on Friday night, when these men come piling into the room, they are no different than any men that we see, generally speaking, when they come into our program, right? They're irritated. They're not happy about having to spend any time and money and whatever else there. They're like, let's just get this over with. And I hear you kind of promise them that they're going to learn something valuable through the weekend, but you're really respectful of where they're at. You're welcome. Tell me whatever you're feeling. If you're unhappy about being here, it's fine. I'm welcome to hear it. Let's just start the conversation. But you set up some rules at the beginning. And can you talk about that, these rules of, we're not going to talk about anybody that's in the room, and how you set those boundaries at the front end?
Well, so we do, you are right. In the very first thing, even the first thing in our essay, I said, I just want you to write, what do you feel when you heard you had to come here? And it's okay. I mean, I know you're giving up a weekend, you're giving up money, it's beautiful weather, you're giving up time with your kids, right? There's a lot of resentment and anger. Some of you may feel that the wrong person got arrested. And so, and that's okay. It's all right to feel that way. There's nothing wrong with how we feel, right? And trying to get them to go ahead and express that. Then we kind of talk about, let's just agree on some things. And so some of the simple things are that we're not going to get high or drunk. Then we talk about needing to talk about ourselves. And I say, everybody here probably wants to talk about what their partner did. This is what she did that got me fired up. This is why I think she did wrong. And I go, at the end of the day, we could all vote that so-and-so had the worst wife in the state of Michigan. And we could all talk about her the whole weekend. Would anything change for him when he went home? No. And I go, so we get so little time to really, what I want to do is take my resentments towards my partner, take all the blame, and kind of set it on the shelf, right? And say, we're going to deal with that later on. We'll get to it. But right now, I want us to say, we're in the room. Let's just talk about the men in the room. What was my part? What did I do? And I do that 2 different times. And you've seen it, Steve. I use it against them later on because they don't follow it.
That's right. That's right.
Talk about it. They all agree. Does that sound like a good idea? Does that make sense? Everybody's yes. They're on board. And they're going to fail at it. And even sometimes I remind them, like there was one guy, I think you were there. I'm like, all right, I counted 12 she's in one eye. All right, let's not go to Kentucky. I just want to stay right here in Lansing, right? What did you do? Let's talk about that. And then he still slipped back in.
And, James, I want to tell you, watching that scenario, it was so difficult for most of the men to do exactly what you asked them to do, to just talk about themselves. Some much more difficult than others, for sure. But the thing that was beautiful about that is every time you brought that up, it wasn't in a, hey, you're messing up, you're not doing it right. It was just almost kind of this humorous way to point out to them what they were doing without really, making them feel small or humiliated. It's just illustrating what we're trying to accomplish. I love the way you did that.
Well, I think some of it is human nature, right? And we talk about that later on at the end. I asked them to grade themselves. I go back to the rules. How did we do on these, gentlemen? And they will grade themselves. Oh my God, we got a D. We got a D. And I'm like, wow, why do we get it? And then I'll make a joke about it being Michigan State D versus a U of M D. But we'll do that. And then so then we talk about, well, why was that so difficult for us? Did we all agree? All right, were you guys lying to me before? No. All right, so why did we struggle? Why do people struggle? So it's really not about them. It's human nature, right? I struggle with being accountable.
Right.
Why do people struggle? So with just taking accountability and just talking about me. And so then we kind of talk about denial being an ego defense mechanism. We talk about shame. We talk about, resentment. So there's all these reasons that get in the way of Jim being able to take accountability and clean up Jim's house, right?
Yeah, and James, what I loved about that conversation was it wasn't you talking to them. They were telling you, oh, because we're ashamed. We don't want to be accountable. We don't want to tell our neighbor here what we had done. That's the most worst thing that we've done in our lives. And you did such a cool job of getting them to tell you what they were afraid of and why they were using that particular protective behavior. It was really, really a cool insight for them, you know?
I think what they like when you do that too, because I have a PowerPoint presentation, right? So as I'm talking, I'm throwing stuff over on the wall, but a lot of times I'll ask stuff before I put it on the wall, and they already answer it all. And so you're like, oh, look at you guys are pretty smart. You guys get this stuff. You throw it up there, boom, you caught this, you caught that, you understood this.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of giving them some credit and not just beating them up, right? All right.
Yeah.
So and we talk about even in the beginning that we all have bad ink on us, right? And I'm more than the worst thing that I've ever done. And we want to just look at, but why was I able to do the worst thing that I did, right? And what was my pathway to get there? And can we examine that and maybe create a different path for ourselves?
That's right. And so if we fast forward, I know you do some things to kind of introduce to them some of the ideas about domestic violence, and they leave there in somewhat of a little bit of a shell shock. You know, it's like, holy cow, what am I into here? But then what the first thing that was super noticeable for me was Saturday morning when they walked in and they start talking about their behavior. I believe you had the power and control wheel out, and they start talking about their behavior without using she and without talk. It was a transformational change overnight. You know, I don't know if what was in their egg McMuffin that they had for breakfast, or if they went and smoked that pot, you know, afterwards, going, "Holy cow, what am I?" But they came back doing it differently almost immediately. You know, how do you think about that?
I think one, the permission that it's okay to be pissed off and mad. It's okay to feel that things didn't happen, and we're not going to judge you for that, right? But we still have some work to do on us, right? So it's kind of, I'm not going to beat them up for having resentments or being pissed off. I had one guy, he came in, and sometimes on Friday, we didn't do it with your group because it was so big. They all talk just about how they feel about being in a room right then. And one guy goes, I'm pissed as hell I got to be in this effing shithole. I could be making $4,000 this week, and instead I'm giving you assholes $200, right? It's $125 for the weekend, but they paid $75 for an assessment. So he was so angry. And in my own head, Steve, and I hate to, I get a little mad sometimes at these guys. Like, they need to take ownership. They need to, and I stop myself, and I always remind myself, hold on, Jim. If he was an accountable man, he wouldn't be in my group, right?
That's right.
And usually my angriest men are the men on Saturday who are going to have the most trauma. So when I remind myself of that, now I can show compassion towards him instead of being defensive and saying, okay, then get out, or if you're not going to do this, or confronting him on his attitude, and just say, I appreciate that. It would be really tough for me to lose $4,000, right? And have to be in a program and have to talk about myself if I had unresolved resentments. I'm hopeful that by Sunday, you will have gotten something out of this, and I think we could do this. And I try to build some hope in there without criticizing them. And I think in the beginning, my men really just don't think they're guilty.
That's
they might admit it was wrong that I pushed you or I slapped you, but they convince themselves you made me do it, right? And once we kind of move that away and just look at the behavior, I think the men are like shocked. They are shocked when they actually look at that wheel and they go, holy cow, I didn't think I was abusive. But I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And we do the same thing that you guys do, where you kind of list all these cruelties. And then you have the guys counted up, but they don't have to admit what one yet. And so we go around the room, and there was guys saying they had 56 tactics, they had 36 tactics. There was some that only had 6 or 5. But there was a lot of guys who came in there on Friday. I'm the victim. She's at fault. I did nothing wrong. This is bullshit. This is a woman's state. This is wrong. Now saying, holy cow, I've done 18 coercive, controlling, relationship destroying behaviors. I think you guys call it cruelty. Some people call it abuse. We kind of do use all 3 languages. I think some people call it abuse, cruelty, but they're relationship destroyers, aren't they?
Yeah, that's a good description for that. I loved when you put that word out there. Yeah, and I thought about that listening to that conversation, because without much coercion or power struggle. The men in the room were just taking ownership of a tremendous amount of behaviors, right? And and the night before, if you had tried to pull that off, they would have never done that. I think they would have dug in and been more resistant. But all of a sudden, in the Saturday morning, they're just, oh, I've done all these behaviors, and so all of a sudden they're kind of, oh yeah, maybe I do need to be here, right? And you just did it by putting information in front of them and having them growing in their introspection. It was really, really fun to watch that process happen.
I tell you another thing that kind of helps with that, and probably people do this more in substance abuse, but we talk for a minute about the Johari window
Yeah,
because we say,
yeah,
this is my goal, right? And we're all here. We have things I let people see about me and they know. I have things that I don't know. And I give examples, right? That I might think I don't have a look, but you talk to my kids, they're like, oh, he has a look. He pierces his lip, the vein pops out his forehead, his face turns red, and how important it is. And then we talk about like the part where I keep hidden. And so we talk about what do I have to have in order to make that window bigger here, right? Someone has to be brave enough to point it out. And we talk about all the reasons why people wouldn't say it. They don't want to hurt my feelings. They don't want to deal with my wrath. They don't want to deal with this. And then we talk about only being as sick as our secrets, right? And that shame driven. And I said, our real goal here that would make us feel that we were successful if we made this window bigger. If you're able to discover some things about you that you didn't know before, and maybe we're willing to say verbally some things that you've never said before,
yeah.
we're 100% successful. And I think they like that vision, you know what I mean? And then then we bring that back when they do that. So we've actually made our window bigger, didn't we? Oh, so we've actually done this, and go back there.
And they referred independently back to that window idea, multiple times when I was listening. That really resonated with them. I want to, as we move through that weekend, you started moving into kind of a trauma-focused approach. You brought out the ACEs questionnaire, you brought out our river of cruelty model and helped them look at that. And I'm wondering, what's your experience with that when you start walking people into looking at their own trauma histories? How do they respond?
It's actually quite amazing because some people think it's a problem because we're digging up all these past traumas, but we use the expanded ACEs, right? So we don't do just the 10. And in a way, I kind of wish I did because I could compare my notes to other states. But since I live in a town where there's a lot of gun violence, a lot of community violence and stuff like that, the expanded ACEs captures more of the traumas that they've experienced as well. And I give them my score both pre and probably go, if I just do the 10, my score is 7. If I go to expanded, I move to an 8, right? And I tell them why. There is men in there that are shocked at how much trauma they've had. And some men have shame. I had one guy when they all went on lunch or break, he stayed in a room. And he goes, can I ask you a question, Jim? And I go, yeah. And he goes, do you think those guys that said 0 and 1 were lying to us? Like he just could not believe that anybody experienced in life didn't have that. And he had like a 13 score out of 16 questions, right?
Yeah.
So and for these men to realize that this changes the way that I perceive myself, right? The internal dialogue in the way that I perceive other people, right? And so and then we try to take that and build from that. We go to your river of cruelty because I think we can pull in those cruelties from the ACEs and we can pull in other cruelties, right? Maybe I was the smallest kid in school and picked on all the time or never picked for sports. And when we look at all those negative emotions and we start looking at our defense mechanisms, we're able to show them that we've been trained and set up at an early age to be dominant and abusive towards women, right? And so this really sets the path. I go, it's not an excuse, but we had a really clear path, a real easy path to follow to stuff those feelings, to deny those feelings, to escape those feelings. So then we're able to look at the consequences of those long term. I think it kind of helps them start to realize, oh, I got some shit to deal with. We also, because we go right from there to working on children exposed.
Yeah.
We look at the trauma that we experienced, but how we're passing that river on, right? And is that what I want to do? Do I want to pass this? Sometimes I don't think I said it that weekend, but a lot of times I'll say, I don't want 10 years from now your kids to come in and say my old man said hi, right? Or Johnny said, that's not what I want. You know what I mean?
Right.
We got to figure out how to stop this.
That's right. And they can see that. What I kind of saw in kind of a really loud way was the men realizing, holy cow, look at us, right? Is this the way all everyone is treated, or is it just those in this room and people who are using violence, right? They were feeling a sense of community by looking at what they had in common, the high ACE scores. If I remember right, in that group we sat in, like the average in this room was like 6.9 or something, or like really, really significant, right? Is that pretty normal for those
That's pretty
groups?
normal. Yeah. I mean, and our score is higher than your score because we have more questions. But I would say we're really in that high 6, low 7 range almost every time. And you know, the interesting thing that I find, so you think, okay, I have all these traumas come from me. I would be crying that I'm a victim. Instead, what the men do is they feel shame. They
Yeah,
feel so
that's right.
much shame for the trauma that happened to them. Just embarrassed. Like some men don't even want to say their number. And it's so, and so, talk about, I should never feel ashamed for what happened to me, but I do, right? Whether I was sexually abused, I was beat, I was in foster care, I was here. That brings so much shame for them
That's
that,
right.
and to be able to acknowledge that and look at that. And because they're not coming here crying, oh, I'm a victim. Look at me. I had all these things happen. They're coming in saying, I'm worthless. Look at what happened,
That's
right?
right. And that's a beautiful segue into, you have incorporated the shadow message and the golden shadow message into this weekend. And you gave me such a nice gift of allowing me to step up and teach a little bit of the shadow message. And I remember so clearly that man who was sitting over there against the wall, who talked about all this trauma and the fact that he had nobody in his life that he could think of who loved him. And he had been really withdrawn during the whole weekend. He had just been staying in the back of the room. And then you invited those people that were in the back of the room to come to the front. And all of a sudden, he starts opening up with, I can't think of anybody who loved me in my life. And he started sharing his story, and it was really profound. And I just loved being in that moment with somebody who may have never shared that kind of experience ever before. And you created this opportunity for him to put it out there. And the room responded in such a supportive, encouraging way. I think they even applauded for him after he was done. It was moving.
And that kid had had horrible things happen. Remember, thrown in dumpsters, had trash dumped on him, so much trauma. And Stephen, you had to leave before the end. But the end, right? The men have to stand up and they say, what their attitude was Friday, what their attitude is now, something they learned, something they didn't like. They say what their golden shadow message was because we want them to leave on a positive message, and they have to acknowledge one person in the room for anything that they did. Now, and I tell them, I don't care. It could be Steve gave me a cigarette when I ran out, or gave me $1 to get a pop out of the machine, or was the first person who smiled at me when I came up and I was insecure. But he had probably 10 people recognize him by name. So when I said,
Wow.
I want to respect Steve, what Steve talked about took a lot of guts and a lot of courage, and that was really amazing. So hear me. I'm the first time I'm vulnerable in front of all these men, and this guy was crying. He was sharing some pretty
Oh,
traumatic
it was
events.
profound for sure.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and he was a guy, yeah, trying to stay out of the room most of the time. And now getting so much recognition and support. I mean, people are applauding for him. I mean, I don't know if this guy's ever been applauded for in his life, right?
That's very, very possible. Yeah. I just thought it was so powerful, and you set that up in a way that, here he is doing something totally different that he's probably never done, and just a few hours of interaction with you and this weekend and with the other men. And so you're already building this community of people who are supporting each other in really short order. So I had to leave, right? I had to go catch a plane and get home, but the weekend went on. And can you just describe, what did I miss, and how do you feel like, what did you get by the end of it? What did you feel like you accomplished?
It's kind of funny because the group's kind of morphed into a mini family peace initiative, art of facilitation training, because we kind of come through. The first day, we're just kind of acknowledging what abuse is and being able to look at that and set it on the table, right? The
Yeah.
next day, we're kind of looking at our own traumatic experiences and how we've passed those on. We're looking at children exposed, which is a pretty big piece. We do the shadow message so we can look at what that negative message was, and we look at substance abuse and domestic violence. We talk a little bit about how many people think that caused it, how many people think this. So many of my guys think that substance abuse is the primary cause, right? Even when you do probation, they'll say things like, "Hey, I bet you work with a lot of idiots," right? I'm not one of those. I love women. I was just drunk that night. So we asked the men how many were drunk or high, how many of them think that caused it. And some of the men know that alcohol doesn't cause it. Some of the men still believe it does. And then we talk about some of the research, and we look at a lot of Larry Bennett stuff, right? How many percentage of men who are alcoholics were abusive when they were drunk? We look at how many people in the substance abuse programs had used violence. We look at his research that 80% of chronic alcoholics have never used violence. So we talk about that, right? And then we talk about it being a pathway into addiction for women, right? So, when they are abused, that really sexual abuse and domestic violence is the number one pathway for addiction for women. At one time, the CDC almost said it was almost a prerequisite, right? And so we bring in that quote, but then we talk about some newer research on provocation, and where they've taken a large group of people, they had them watch these videos where there's domestic violence going on, and they're supposed to interpret who's the primary aggressor and by what percentage, how much did the other person provoke them. And they almost had universal answers from men, women, gay, straights, black, Latinos, white, right? And we thought there might be differences, that the genders might think differently or the cultures and races might be differently. And we really didn't. When they look at these college campuses with large groups of 150 kids, they were really identifying things exactly the same. Then they got these kids drunk, and they had them watch almost identical videos. What happened was the men who sobered Jim rated you as 0 provoking or 1% provoking or 2% provoking, all of a sudden rated you as 6% provoking, right? And the women tended to underrate the level of aggression of the men. So sober woman said, Jim's at an 8. If he's over a 5, I'm in danger. I better start kissing rear end, get out of the house, call 911. But now she moved me back down to a 5, which she thinks she can manage. And I interpret her behavior, which maybe was a 2. And in our relationship, we can handle a 2. But I interpret it as a 6, which is no way in heck I'm going to tolerate that. And now if she comes at me at a 6, what does Jim have to do to win? I'm going to come at her at an 8. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we talked about it really being, it messes with our perception. And then I go back and think, well, no, she caused it. She made this happen. And that I'm responsible for that perception. So we do a little bit about that on Friday. And that's kind of the end of Saturday. Sunday, we come in and we go back into the golden shadow message, right? Because we I've had to look at this stuff I've done that's pretty shameful. I've looked at my trauma, first we start off just how are people feeling? Did they sleep okay last night? What was difficult? Because I've had one man once raise his hand. He goes, I didn't sleep worth a shit after you pulled that stunt on us yesterday. I go, what stunt? And then he ended up talking about sexual abuse, right? Yeah. And then he couldn't sleep. And so some men, and I do that. After they do that ACE score, I should have said this. We all say our score and we write it on the board, but no one has to say what they checked off. But I open up the room. Is there anybody? I go, I'm never going to out any of you, and this is your personal stuff, and I'll see it. But is there anybody who wants to talk about what they checked or anything stand up to them or what they feel? And so it's sometimes a guy will talk about sexual abuse, or a guy will talk about, being abandoned by their parents somewhere, or talk about pretty traumatic events. It's interesting. Those guys who talk about that and are most vulnerable are also the people who get the most recognition at the end. So it's just really nice to have my name told that I'm brave when I'm feeling like a wimp because I broke down and cried in front of these guys. And instead, they're saying, no, you were amazing. One day a guy talked about sexual abuse, and 5 other men, all who had checked off they'd been sexually abused, were the one who recognized him. And they didn't admit that. And one guy said, he was like, Steve, when you talked about things I would never be strong enough to admit. I would never have the courage to do that. That was so amazing. And I have so much support and respect for you. Right. And so for me to sit there, it's a really nice way to end the day. So after we do that golden shadow message, which we're trying to remind people that you have value, you have worth, you're more than the worst thing that you've done, and we can change that behavior, right? So that shame versus guilt kind of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's one of my favorite conversations in the whole work because it shows in really simple, process that people's behavior is evidence of how they believe about themselves. And if I believe my shadow message, then I go behave one way. And if I believe my golden shadow message, I go behave a totally different way. And people will solve their own problems, right? If your golden shadow message was true that you are worthy and loved and special and whatever it would be, how would you have handled that difficult situation? And they will just say, oh, I would have just sat down and listened to what you had to say, or I would have just kind of apologized and moved on, or I would have never done that, what I did, right? I would have never yelled and screamed and hit. And so they can identify that, oh, how I believe about myself drives my behavior towards others. And you did that. It really bubbled up nicely during the weekend.
and we'll correct people because sometimes they'll say, like, I'm just an asshole. And then we redefine that. When I say that, what does that give me permission to do?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
It really gets reaffirmed that. And some people are religious, so we might talk about confessing things as though they are and those to come to pass, right? So we can talk about that. But we try to re-identify ourselves as men of integrity and men of honor,
You
right? And
used that language a lot in the weekend, and the men started listening to that, right? Integrity and honor. What does that mean for me, kind of thing. I love the way you just kept that in there in the conversation.
we had even looked, our program's called Accountable Choices because we're saying this is all about a choice, right? And so am I making accountable choices or unaccountable choices? And what does that look like? But we have considered changing our name to Men of Integrity, right? A
Mm.
more positive name. And when I talked about it with the group, they liked the Accountable Choices name better. So I stayed with that. Gene suggested I'm talking to the wrong people. I'm talking to people who are already in the group, and I need to talk to men who haven't ever gone to a group.
Oh, that's
And
interesting. Yeah.
which would you be more likely to join? Would you
Mhm.
join a Men of Integrity group or would you join an Accountable Choices group? And I thought, oh, that's it. Yeah, because I've never asked men who haven't been in programs. I only ask men who have
Yeah.
been in the program.
Yeah, that's a good point. James, we're gonna have to bring this kind of to a close, but before we do that, I'd love for you to talk about what you see the benefit or the value, how these men are different when they come into the groups, or if they've been in there a couple of weeks, how do they change or how are they different once they've been through the weekend?
So once you go into the weekend, they just drop so many defenses. You're like, it takes us weeks to get people to drop those defenses in the weekly sessions. It seems like once they've done this, they go into follow up. What we call follow up is a programming, just so much less resistant, and they have a pathway. Like we may not have gotten to the perfect shadow message, we may not have gotten to the perfect thing, but now they have that foundation and they know what they're looking for and where they're going to be going. And they say that treatment or any type of intervention is really based on connection, right? My connection, with that client. And I think having this long period of time, it's almost like hazing together or something. Like we become a real group that supports one another. We
Mhm.
want what's best for each other. They realize, they know me so much more than
Yeah,
what they would have seen me. If you
that's
think about
right.
it, when you come in for an hour and a half to 2 hours, you're in, we get a little movement from you, but then we throw you back into the world where you get all these
Mhm.
other messages that are pulling you back, right?
Yeah.
I get 16 hours to really go a little bit deeper and without all that interruption of you being sucked back in right away. Now, you still can get sucked back in. I'm not saying that it's
Mhm.
wonderful, but for our program, we have just found it to move people along so much quicker and allow us to get to a much deeper level faster with these men and have a better connection. These guys, they know me, they have my number, they feel they can call me. How they call me, tell me this got diagnosed with cancer or this is happening. I mean, the things that they go through that are really traumatic for them, they feel comfortable and safe talking about now.
Yeah, it's amazing the relationship that I watched being fostered between you and all these men. And one of the things that I watched you doing really strategically, at least from my perspective, was your ability to use your own story to kind of normalize what you were teaching them. And I felt like that was huge in helping them connect with you and humanize you instead of, putting you on this professional pedestal, right? You were just kind of here's my journey, and I felt like that was really valuable.
Yeah, I think we think alike in that, right? I mean, not asking people to share stuff that we wouldn't do. And I think they do feel more comfortable and they feel like, okay, there's some legitimacy here with what this guy's saying.
Yeah, that's a good word, this legitimacy. We're all doing it in our own journeys. We're having the same kind of experiences, challenges. Uh, Man, I
So
tell you, when I you know, spent the whole weekend, I really didn't know what to expect. And I walked out of there just going, wow, that is such a springboard into the work that remains inside the group. And, I know in our communities in Kansas, we've struggled against people just doing Saturday afternoon classes. And I didn't walk out there going, oh, this weekend is the answer. I walked out of there going, what an amazing precursor to the work, kind of prepping the kitchen for the cooking that has to happen afterwards, right? But it was a really profound experience for me. And, I just want to thank you for, being so persistent about, Steve, I want to share this with you. Come see it. Come see it. And it's like, I'm so glad I got that chance to do that.
well, and I really appreciate you being there. And I think one of the things, the questions you asked me, I think when we do this, we have to think really strategically, what is it that I want as my end goal at this weekend,
Yeah.
right? Do I want to create the internal dialogue? Am I trying to create connection? Am I trying to deal with shame versus guilt? Like what is my goal? And of each little exercise I'm trying to cram in there, does that meet the goal of my objective? Because sometimes
Yeah.
you just try to show up everything in there, including the kitchen sink, and sometimes you need to take the sink out and just focus on these big things. But it was really amazing to have you guys there. It was a bigger group than normal. Normally we only have 50. We are double the size of what it's supposed to be. So I was also blessed that you and Paul were willing to split the group into 3 segments to do a little bit of work, and that was very helpful. So
That was fun. It felt like we could contribute a little bit to the work that you're doing. I just want to say that I know nobody on the planet who pursues knowledge around battery intervention and domestic violence the way you do. And I have learned so much from you over the years about how to do things, how to think outside of the box, how to put different approaches together to make something that's even more powerful. And I just admire so much. I feel so lucky to have this connection with you, James. It's just been such a cool thing for me and for Dorothy. And I want to thank you for that. And please don't stop. We have a lot to learn yet.
I appreciate you. It was almost a mini family peace initiative group, so it was probably easy for you to be there, but I really appreciate it.
Well,
it was amazing.
My challenge is sitting there and keeping my mouth shut. And overall, I feel like I did pretty good, but no promises next time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it very much and appreciate your guys' time and all the work that you guys do as well. And you giving up a whole weekend, spending your own time and money on a hotel and a flight after already being away from home for a week doing a conference. I really, really appreciate that. It meant the world to me.